The beef braciole sat untouched on the white tablecloth, steam rising into the dim light of the private room at Danico restaurant in Little Italy. Jack Garcia watched the three men across from him, his hands resting calmly on either side of his plate, while every nerve in his body screamed that something had shifted in the last 60 seconds. Sonny Ciccone, a capo in the Gambino crime family, had stopped eating mid-bite and was now staring at Jack with an expression that lived somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. To Sonny's left, Tommy Muscles had pushed his chair back slightly, creating space for his hand to reach the weapon Jack knew he carried at his waistband. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap, and Jack understood with absolute clarity that the next words out of his mouth would determine whether he walked out of this restaurant or was carried out in pieces. The question Sonny had asked seemed simple enough on the surface. He had leaned back in his chair, dabbed marinara sauce from his lips with a cloth napkin, and asked Jack to remind him which crew in Miami he had run with back in the 80s. It was the kind of question made men asked each other constantly, testing memory and verifying stories that should be consistent because they were true. Except Jack had never run with any crew in Miami in the 80s, because in the 80s he had been a young FBI agent working white-collar crime in New York, living a completely different life under his real name, the legend his FBI handlers had constructed for him, the elaborate backstory that transformed Jack Garcia into Jack Falcone, a heavyweight gambler and loan shark from Miami with Mafia connections, was being stress-tested in real time by a man whose survival depended on detecting exactly the kind of deception Jack was perpetrating. Jack picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip of Chianti, and began to talk. He mentioned names of deceased Miami mobsters his FBI research team had verified, referenced a gambling operation that had actually existed on Collins Avenue, and described a dispute over territory that old newspaper clippings confirmed had occurred. He spoke with the casual authority of someone recounting actual memories rather than reciting prepared material, and he watched Sonny's face for any flicker of doubt or disbelief. When he finished, he cut into his braciole and took a bite, the gesture communicating that he considered the question answered, and the subject closed. Sonny held his gaze for 3 more seconds, an eternity measured in heartbeats, then smiled and returned to his own meal, the tension dissolving as quickly as it had materialized. Joaquin Jack Garcia had entered this world of suspicion and sudden violence deliberately, volunteering for an assignment that most FBI agents considered borderline suicidal. Born in Cuba and raised in Miami after his family fled Castro's regime, Jack had joined the FBI in 1980 with dreams of fighting communist espionage and protecting American national security. Instead, he spent his early years investigating bank fraud, insurance scams, and the kind of financial crimes that rarely made headlines and never required the undercover work that secretly fascinated him. He was good at the work, meticulous and patient, but part of him yearned for something more immediate and dangerous. That yearning found its outlet in 1996, when the FBI's Organized Crime Division began searching for an agent who could infiltrate the Italian Mafia at a level no bureau operative had achieved since Donnie Brasco 20 years earlier. The challenge was immense, and the risks were existential. The Mafia in the late 1990s was weakened, but far from finished, still controlling sectors of construction, garbage collection, labor unions, and illegal gambling across New York and New Jersey. Federal prosecutions had devastated the 5 families throughout the 80s and early 90s, sending bosses to prison under RICO statutes and flipping made men into cooperating witnesses who exposed the organization's secrets. But the Mafia adapted, becoming more cautious and paranoid, implementing security measures specifically designed to detect undercover law enforcement. They required longer relationships before trusting newcomers, conducted background investigations, using contacts in legitimate businesses and government offices, and remained perpetually alert for the signs that someone might be wearing a wire or working for the feds. Jack Garcia was 42 years old when he raised his hand for the assignment that would consume the next 3 years of his life. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. A physical presence that suggested power and confidence, rather than the bureaucratic caution typically associated with federal agents. His Cuban heritage gave him olive skin and dark features that could pass for Italian, and his upbringing in Miami's Cuban community had familiarized him with the cultural codes of honor, respect, and hierarchy that also governed Mafia life. Most importantly, he possessed the psychological traits FBI behavioral analysts identified as essential for deep cover work: the ability to lie convincingly without exhibiting stress, the capacity to maintain separate identities without confusion, and the nerve to function normally while surrounded by people who would kill him instantly if they discovered his true purpose. The Bureau's undercover operation, codenamed Gangrene, launched in 2002, with Jack assuming the identity of Jack Falcone, a wealthy Italian-American businessman and high-stakes gambler. His legend placed him in Miami during the 80s and 90s, running a loan sharking operation that catered to gamblers and businessmen, making enough money to retire comfortably, but remaining connected to the life through friendships with wise guys. The FBI created documentation supporting every element of this backstory. Credit cards with years of purchase history, property records showing homes he had supposedly owned, even photographs doctored to show Jack at locations and events consistent with his legend. They provided him with a wardrobe of expensive suits, jewelry, and watches that advertised wealth without appearing ostentatious. And they gave him access to bureau funds that allowed him to gamble, spend, and live at the level his cover identity required. His entry point into the Gambino family came through Gregory De Palma, a capo who controlled operations in Westchester County and maintained interests in Florida real estate and gambling. Jack engineered their introduction through an intermediary, a gambler with connections to both legitimate business and organized crime, who vouched for Jack as a serious player with money to invest. The first meeting occurred at a diner in Yonkers, casual and public, where De Palma sized Jack up over coffee and Danish pastries. Jack presented himself as a man looking to invest in New York opportunities, someone with capital and experience who understood how things worked and knew when to ask questions and when to keep his mouth shut. De Palma responded cautiously but with interest, seeing potential profit in this wealthy stranger who seemed to respect the protocols and hierarchies that governed their world. Over the following months, Jack cultivated the relationship through repeated contact and carefully calibrated favors. He gambled at establishments De Palma controlled, losing enough money to demonstrate he was a serious player, but not so much that it seemed reckless or suspicious. He invested in legitimate businesses that funneled kickbacks to De Palma's crew, creating financial relationships that benefited the Gambinos while giving Jack deeper access to their operations. He attended social functions, weddings, and funerals, the ritual gatherings where Mafia members reinforced their bonds and assessed each other's loyalty and character. And throughout all of it, he wore a wire, recording conversations that documented extortion, loan sharking, gambling operations, and murder conspiracies. The psychological strain of living as Jack Falcone was constant and cumulative. Every conversation required complete immersion in character, because a single slip, calling someone by the wrong name, referencing a TV show that didn't fit his legend, or displaying knowledge that Jack Falcone couldn't possess, could trigger suspicion that would cascade into disaster. Jack lived alone in a bureau-rented apartment, maintaining complete separation between his undercover identity and his real life, unable to contact his family, except through supervised channels that prevented any possibility of his real identity bleeding into his cover. He gained weight from the constant restaurant meals and enforced inactivity that came with playing a wealthy gambler rather than an active FBI agent. And he carried the knowledge that the men he was befriending, sharing meals with, and pretending to respect were killers who had murdered people for offenses far less serious than infiltrating their organization while wearing a federal wire. The operation expanded beyond the Gambinos in 2004, when Jack made contact with members of the Bonanno crime family through his gambling activities. The Bonannos had been devastated by the Donnie Brasco infiltration in the 1970s, which led to multiple murders within the family when members were suspected of having been too trusting of the undercover FBI agent Joe Pistone. That history made them simultaneously more paranoid about potential infiltrators and more valuable as targets, because their extreme caution meant that anyone who successfully penetrated their organization had overcome their most sophisticated defenses. Jack's initial contact was with Tommy Fiore, a Bonanno associate who ran bookmaking operations in Brooklyn and was constantly looking for high-stakes gamblers who could be recruited as clients or partners. Jack and Tommy met at a sports bar in Bay Ridge, where Jack established himself as someone who bet serious money on football, basketball, and baseball games. He lost $40,000 to Tommy over the first 2 months of their relationship. Money the FBI provided, and Tommy collected, building trust through financial transactions that proved Jack was who he claimed to be. Tommy introduced Jack to other Bonanno associates, expanding his network and creating opportunities to record additional crimes. But the real breakthrough came when Tommy mentioned that his crew was looking for someone to invest in a drug deal, a shipment of ecstasy coming from Europe that needed upfront financing. Jack expressed interest, and suddenly, he was being invited to meetings with higher-ranking members of the Bonanno family. The situation Jack now faced was unprecedented in FBI history. He was simultaneously cultivating relationships with 2 different crime families, the Gambinos through Gregory DePalma and the Bonannos through Tommy Fiore, while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a wealthy, independent operator with no exclusive loyalty to any particular organization. This arrangement was extraordinarily dangerous because it violated Mafia protocol, which expected associates to align with a single family and view other families as potential rivals. Jack had to carefully manage both relationships, ensuring that neither family discovered the extent of his involvement with the other, while gathering evidence against both. The balancing act required constant awareness of who knew what about his activities, which stories he had told to whom, and which crimes he had been invited to participate in by each organization. By 2005, Jack had been working undercover for nearly 3 years, and the strain was becoming visible despite his professional discipline. He had gained over 70 pounds from the sedentary lifestyle and rich restaurant food that came with playing a wealthy gambler. He was drinking more than he should, using alcohol to manage the stress of maintaining his double life and the isolation that came from having no genuine human connections. His marriage had deteriorated under the pressure of his prolonged absence and inability to explain where he was or what he was doing, and he was experiencing symptoms of what bureau psychologists would later identify as dissociative identity disorder, moments where he struggled to remember which version of himself he was supposed to be in a given context. The Gambino family moved first toward offering Jack membership. Gregory DePalma approached him at a private dinner in Little Italy. Just the 2 of them, in a back room at a restaurant De Palma's crew controlled. Gregory explained that the family's leadership had been watching Jack, evaluating his character and his earning potential, and had decided he was the kind of man they wanted in the organization. He asked Jack if he understood what it meant to be a made man, the ceremonies, the obligations, and the oath of loyalty that superseded all other relationships, including family. Jack responded with carefully rehearsed enthusiasm, expressing honor at being considered while avoiding any statement that could later be interpreted as having actually taken a Mafia oath, which would create legal complications for the Bureau. De Palma explained the process. Jack would need to be sponsored by a current made member, which De Palma would do personally. He would need to have Italian heritage, which Jack claimed through his mother's family, a lie the FBI had prepared documentation to support. And he would need to participate in a making ceremony where he would take the oath and have his finger pricked to draw blood, symbolizing his willingness to die for the family. De Palma suggested the ceremony would happen within the next few months, pending final approval from the family's administration. Jack left that dinner knowing he had achieved something extraordinary, but also knowing that accepting actual membership would cross legal and ethical lines that would compromise his testimony and potentially invalidate years of investigative work. If you're still watching this story unfold, if you understand that some missions require men to lose themselves completely in order to protect others, go ahead and like this video and comment the word infiltrate below. Let's see how many of us recognize that the line between the hunter and the hunted can become razor thin when you're living among wolves. The Bonanno family made their approach 6 weeks later, and the timing created an immediate crisis. Jack was having dinner with Tommy Fiore and 2 other Bonanno associates when one of them, a capo named Anthony Graziano, asked Jack directly whether he would be interested in becoming a friend of ours. The Mafia euphemism for membership. Jack felt his blood pressure spike even as he maintained his external composure, understanding that he was now being courted by both families simultaneously. He responded to Graziano with the same carefully calibrated enthusiasm he had shown De Palma, expressing respect and interest while avoiding any commitment that would constitute accepting membership. But internally, he understood the situation had become exponentially more dangerous. The problem was simple and potentially lethal. If the Gambinos discovered that the Bonannos were also moving to make Jack, they would interpret it as betrayal, as Jack playing both families against each other for personal advantage. If the Bonannos learned about the Gambino offer, they would draw the same conclusion. And if either family suspected betrayal, the response would be immediate and violent. Jack would be called to a meeting and never return, his body disappearing into one of the construction sites or landfills the Mafia controlled throughout New York and New Jersey. He needed to manage both families' expectations without revealing the existence of the other relationship, while simultaneously coordinating with his FBI handlers to determine the Bureau's strategy for extracting him before either making ceremony occurred. The FBI's response was to accelerate the timeline for ending the operation and making arrests. Bureau leadership recognized that Jack had gathered sufficient evidence to prosecute dozens of Mafia members in both families for crimes ranging from extortion and gambling to murder conspiracy. They also understood that allowing Jack to participate in an actual making ceremony would create legal complications and potentially expose him to murder contracts that would follow him for the rest of his life once the prosecutions became public. The decision was made to extract Jack and execute simultaneous raids on both families within 90 days, before either making ceremony could occur. That meant Jack had 3 months to maintain his cover, while knowing that every meeting could be his last. The next phase of the operation was the most dangerous because Jack's behavior had to remain completely consistent. even as bureau agents prepared arrest warrants and prosecutors assembled indictments. Any change in his routine, any unusual absence or evasive response to invitations would signal that something had shifted. So Jack continued gambling, continued investing in the family's operations, and continued wearing wires that recorded conversations for prosecutions he knew were imminent. He attended a wedding where Gregory De Palma introduced him to senior Gambino leadership as the family's newest prospect. He participated in a sit-down between Bonanno members, where disputes over territory were resolved through negotiation rather than violence. And he was included because Anthony Graziano wanted the family's leadership to see the quality of man being proposed for membership. During this period, Jack experienced what he would later describe as the closest call of his entire undercover career. He was having dinner with 4 Gambino associates at a restaurant in Queens when one of them, a veteran mobster named Salvatore, asked Jack a question about a robbery that had occurred in Miami in 1987. The question seemed random, unconnected to anything they had been discussing, and Jack felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that signaled potential exposure. He asked Salvatore to clarify what he was asking about, buying time to search his memory for any reference to such a robbery in the legend the FBI had constructed. Salvatore explained that a jewelry store had been robbed on Collins Avenue in Miami, and several people connected to organized crime had been questioned by police. Jack maintained eye contact and projected calm while his mind raced through possibilities. Was this a genuine question based on information Salvatore had obtained about actual events in Miami during that period? Or was it a fabricated scenario designed to test whether Jack would claim knowledge of something that never happened? He decided on a strategy of cautious denial rather than vacation. He told Salvatore that he didn't remember anything about that specific robbery, that Miami in the 80s had enough robberies and police investigations that one jewelry store job wouldn't necessarily register in his memory, especially since he had been focused on his loan sharking business rather than theft crews. He asked Salvatore why he was asking, turning the question back to determine whether there was additional context that would help Jack navigate the conversation. Salvatore explained that his cousin had been questioned in that robbery and had mentioned knowing a big Cuban guy who was running money on the beach around that time. He wondered if Jack was the guy his cousin had mentioned. Jack felt relief wash through him, even as he maintained his external composure, understanding now that this was genuine inquiry rather than a planned test. He told Salvatore it was possible that he knew a lot of people in Miami during that period and had a reputation among gamblers and hustlers, but that he couldn't confirm without knowing the cousin's name. Salvatore mentioned a name Jack didn't recognize, and the conversation moved on to other topics. Later, Jack would report the exchange to his handlers, who would verify that the robbery had occurred and that Salvatore's cousin had indeed been questioned, a coincidence that had come within inches of exposing inconsistencies in Jack's legend. The pressure intensified as both families accelerated their timelines for making Jack a member. Gregory De Palma informed Jack that the Gambino ceremony was scheduled for April 2005, just 6 weeks away. Anthony Graziano told Jack that the Bonannos wanted to move forward even sooner, potentially within a month, because several members of their administration were facing federal indictments and wanted to complete pending business before potential imprisonments disrupted the EU family's operations. Jack was now in the surreal position of being courted for membership by 2 crime families simultaneously, each unaware of the other's intentions, while he worked with FBI prosecutors to finalize charges that would destroy both organizations' leadership. The extraction plan required Jack to gradually reduce his visibility without disappearing so completely that it would trigger suspicion. He began mentioning to both families that he was considering business opportunities in Florida that might require him to spend more time in Miami. He claimed that his gambling debts in New York had grown large enough that some bookmakers were becoming uncomfortable, and he needed to let things cool down for a few weeks. He reduced the frequency of his meetings while maintaining enough contact to continue gathering evidence. And he coordinated with Bureau surveillance teams to ensure that he was never alone with Mafia members in locations where he could be killed without witnesses, a precaution that became more critical as the families grew more invested in him. The moment when Jack came closest to being made by the Gambinos in the worst possible sense occurred 3 weeks before the planned arrests. He was called to a meeting with Gregory DePalma at a social club in the Bronx, told to come alone and to arrive after dark. Every instinct Jack had developed over 3 years undercover told him this meeting was dangerous. The location was a Gambino stronghold where multiple murders had occurred over the years. The timing, late evening, when fewer people would be on the streets to witness anything unusual, suggested something outside normal business discussions. And the instruction to come alone violated the pattern of their previous meetings, which typically included other family members. Jack informed his FBI handlers of the meeting and requested immediate surveillance and backup. The Bureau positioned multiple teams around the social club, with instructions to intervene if Jack failed to emerge within 90 minutes, or if they observed any indication he was in immediate danger. Jack wore a wire and carried a concealed panic button that would alert surveillance teams if he was searched or threatened. He arrived at the club at the appointed time, knocked on the steel door, and was admitted by a Gambino soldier who locked the door behind him. Inside, he found Gregory DePalma and 2 other men he recognized as senior family members, sitting at a table in a back room with glasses of wine and a deck of cards. For the next hour, they talked about business, about gambling operations and construction contracts and labor union positions that were being negotiated. The conversation was so normal, so consistent with dozens of previous meetings, that Jack began to wonder if his instincts had been wrong. Then DePalma stood up, walked to a cabinet, and removed something wrapped in a cloth. He set it on the table and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a handgun, a semi-automatic 9mm that looked well-maintained and recently cleaned. Jack felt his heart rate spike as he calculated distances to the door, assessed which of the 3 men represented the most immediate threat, and prepared to activate his panic button. DePalma picked up the weapon and handed it to Jack with a smile. He explained that this gun had historical significance to the Gambino family, having been carried by a legendary soldier who had since passed away. DePalma wanted Jack to have it as a gift, a symbol of the family's respect and their anticipation of making him a member. He said the gun represented the tradition Jack would be joining, a lineage of men who protected their own and dealt with their enemies decisively. Jack accepted the weapon with expressions of gratitude and honor, while internally recognizing the trap he now faced. If he kept the gun and it was later used in a crime by someone else in the family, he could be implicated. If he refused it, he would insult DePalma and possibly trigger the suspicion he had worked 3 years to avoid. He solved the problem by explaining that he was honored to receive such a meaningful gift, but that he was currently being careful about being caught with weapons because of some unrelated legal exposure in Florida. He asked whether DePalma would hold the gun for him until after his making ceremony, when he would officially be under the family's protection and less worried about police attention. DePalma accepted this explanation and returned the weapon to the cabinet, the crisis passing as quickly as it had materialized. Jack left the social club 90 minutes after arriving, signaled all clear to his surveillance teams, and drove to a bureau safe house where he collapsed from the accumulated stress and adrenaline depletion. The final 2 weeks of the operation were a countdown that Jack experienced with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because the end of his undercover assignment meant returning to his real life, recovering his actual identity, and escaping the constant threat of discovery and death. Dread because he had spent 3 years building relationships with these men, eating with them, gambling with them, and pretending to value their respect and friendship. Despite knowing they were criminals and killers, despite understanding that they would murder him instantly if they learned the truth, he had developed a strange form of attachment that came from shared experiences and genuine moments of human connection. He knew that some of them, particularly Gregory DePalma, had come to view him as a friend rather than just an asset. And he knew that sense of betrayal would cut deeply when the arrests occurred. The FBI executed Operation Gangrene on March 10, 2005, with coordinated pre-dawn raids across New York, New Jersey, and Florida. More than 300 federal agents participated in arresting 32 members and associates of the Gambino and Bonanno families on charges including murder conspiracy, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and labor racketeering. Jack was extracted from his undercover apartment hours before the raids, relocated to a secure facility where he would be debriefed and prepared for the testimony that would follow. He watched news coverage of the arrests on television, seeing men he had shared meals with being led out of their homes in handcuffs, and felt the complex emotional response of someone who had succeeded completely in his mission while losing something fundamental about his sense of self. The prosecutions that followed established Jack Garcia as the most successful undercover FBI operative to penetrate the Italian Mafia since Joe Pistone's Donnie Brasco operation 30 years earlier. His testimony, supported by hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, led to convictions of virtually every defendant. Gregory DePalma was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, dying of kidney failure before completing his sentence. Anthony Graziano received 15 years for racketeering and extortion. The evidence Jack gathered dismantled significant portions of both families' operations in New York and seriously degraded their capacity to earn money through traditional rackets. Federal prosecutors called it one of the most significant organized crime cases in decades. But the personal cost to Jack was severe and lasting. His marriage ended in divorce, a casualty of 3 years of enforced separation and the psychological damage that came from living 2 completely separate lives. He struggled with weight-related health issues stemming from the 75 pounds he gained during the operation and never fully lost afterward. He experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress, including nightmares where he was discovered by the Mafia and killed, and dissociative episodes where he responded to his undercover name rather than his real one. The Bureau provided psychological support, but no amount of counseling could fully address the fundamental disorientation that came from having pretended so thoroughly to be someone else that the boundaries between identities had blurred. The revelation that shocked the law enforcement community most was how close both families had come to making Jack a full member. FBI analysis of the recorded conversations revealed that the Gambinos had scheduled his making ceremony for April 15, 2005, just 5 weeks after the arrests occurred. The Bonannos had been moving even faster, with some family members advocating for an emergency ceremony in late March. If the Bureau had delayed the operation by even a month, Jack would have faced the impossible choice of either participating in a making ceremony, which would have compromised his legal standing and potentially his safety, or refusing and almost certainly being killed. The margin between success and catastrophe had been measured in weeks. Jack retired from the FBI in 2008, having achieved a distinction shared by only one other law enforcement officer in history, being formally proposed for membership in an American Mafia family. The other officer was Joe Pistone, whose Donnie Brasco operation in the 1970s had similarly penetrated the Bonanno family and come within days of a making ceremony before the Bureau extracted him. Both men paid enormous personal costs for their success, living under the perpetual threat of Mafia retribution and carrying the psychological scars of having lived double lives so completely that their actual identities became difficult to recover. Both also fundamentally altered how the FBI approached organized crime investigations, proving that long-term undercover penetration could achieve results that traditional surveillance and informant development could not. In the years after his retirement, Jack wrote a memoir describing his experiences and spoke publicly about the operation and its impact on his life. He was candid about the costs, the destroyed marriage, the health problems, the psychological damage, and the strange sense of loss he felt about relationships that had been completely artificial, but had felt genuinely meaningful during the years he maintained them. He described moments of sympathy for men like Gregory De Palma, who he recognized as products of a culture that valued loyalty and honor, even while using those values to justify criminal brutality. And he acknowledged the fundamental strangeness of having been genuinely liked and respected by people who would have killed him without hesitation if they had known the truth. The question that haunted Jack after the operation ended was what would have happened if he had been made. Not practically, he understood the Bureau would have extracted him before allowing that to occur, but psychologically and morally. What would it have meant to take a blood oath to an organization he was simultaneously destroying? How would he have reconciled the ceremony's meaning to the men who believed in it, with his own mission to put those same men in prison? He concluded that some lines cannot be crossed without fundamentally changing the person who crosses them, and that the Bureau's decision to end the operation before his making ceremonies was as much about protecting him from that transformation as about preserving the legal integrity of the prosecutions. The families eventually learned the full extent of what Jack had accomplished. During the trials, when prosecutors presented the hundreds of hours of recordings and the detailed documentation of crimes Jack had witnessed and participated in while wearing a wire, the defendants realized how completely they had been deceived. Some expressed grudging respect for the professionalism of his performance. Others, particularly those who had genuinely liked him, expressed a sense of personal betrayal that transcended the legal consequences they faced. Gregory De Palma reportedly said that Jack had been so convincing that he would have trusted him with his life, a statement that carried particular irony, given that Jack's actual purpose had been to ensure De Palma spent the rest of his life in prison. The operation's broader impact extended beyond the specific prosecutions to fundamentally alter how the Mafia approached security and trust. The five families became even more cautious about accepting new members or associates, implementing additional background checks, and extending the observation periods before allowing outsiders into positions of confidence. They became more paranoid about electronic surveillance, conducting business in locations they swept for devices, and avoiding specific language that could be used against them in court. And they became more brutal toward anyone suspected of being an informant or undercover operative, with several murders in subsequent years attributed to Mafia security concerns about potential infiltration. Jack's testimony about how close he came to being discovered despite his extensive training and the Bureau's sophisticated legend development revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in undercover operations. He described moments when a single inconsistent detail could have exposed him, when a chance encounter with someone who knew the real story behind a piece of his legend could have triggered questions he couldn't answer. He acknowledged that luck had played as large a role as skill in his survival, that there were moments when things could have gone differently, and he would have been killed before his handlers even knew he was in danger. This honesty about the operation's risks led the Bureau to reassess protocols for deep cover work and to place stricter limitations on the duration and depth of future undercover penetrations. The psychological research that emerged from studying Jack's experience and that of other long-term undercover operatives identified a pattern of identity confusion and dissociation that became known as undercover syndrome. Agents who spent extended periods living false identities reported difficulty reintegrating into their actual lives, preferring in some cases to maintain aspects of their undercover personas because those identities felt more authentic than their legal ones. They described feeling more comfortable with criminals than with fellow law enforcement officers, understanding the rules and expectations of the criminal world better than the bureaucratic culture of their agencies, and they struggled with questions of authenticity and self-knowledge, wondering which version of themselves represented their true character. Jack lived the rest of his life with a peculiar form of dual consciousness, remembering events from his undercover years as both himself and as the character he had played. He would recall dinners with Gregory De Palma simultaneously as FBI agent Jack Garcia, gathering evidence, and as Jack Falcone enjoying the company of a friend. He maintained the weight and physical presence of his undercover identity, unable or unwilling to return to the lighter frame he had carried before the operation. And he remained vigilant about security, aware that while most Mafia members from his cases were imprisoned or dead, the organization's long memory and culture of vendetta meant he would never be completely safe from retribution. The story of how Jack Garcia almost became a made member of two different crime families simultaneously represents an extraordinary moment in the history of American law enforcement's war against organized crime. It demonstrated that even organizations as security-conscious and paranoid as the Mafia could be penetrated by a sufficiently skilled and committed operative. It proved that the FBI could still conduct successful long-term undercover operations despite the Mafia's awareness of such tactics from previous cases like Donnie Brasco. And it showed that the line between infiltrator and member, between pretending to be something and actually becoming it, was thinner and more dangerous than anyone had fully understood. The operation ended with Jack Garcia's identity intact but transformed, having spent 3 years being someone else so completely that returning to himself required conscious effort and psychological reconstruction. He had walked among killers and been accepted as one of them. He had been offered membership in a secret society that valued loyalty above law and punished betrayal with death. And he had come within weeks of crossing a threshold that would have changed everything, not just legally, but existentially, taking an oath that meant nothing to him but everything to the men who watched him take it. That he succeeded in avoiding that final step while gathering the evidence to destroy the organizations courting him stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of American undercover law enforcement. In the end, Jack Garcia proved that courage in law enforcement isn't always about confronting danger directly. Sometimes it's about sitting across from killers at dinner tables, smiling and sharing stories while carrying the secret that could get you killed. It's about maintaining perfect calm when a single wrong answer to a casual question would expose everything. It's about living two lives so completely that neither feels entirely real, sacrificing your actual identity to inhabit a false one convincingly enough to fool people whose survival depends on detecting exactly that kind of deception. Jack did all of that for 3 years, and he did it so well that 2 different crime families believed he was worthy of their most sacred trust. That they were wrong about who he was, but right about his extraordinary capabilities, remains the operation's central irony and its greatest success.